Thank you. It's always nice to come and talk with you and everyone else. And I'm very happy to be here. So I hope, like you said, in this COVID time period, still that everyone out there is feeling well and healthy and keeping safe. And so tonight, our subject tonight is going to be, can I grieve if nobody died? So I'll back it up a little bit in case you don't know me. I've been with the Department of Aging and Disabilities for about 10 years now, and I'm a registered nurse. I've done case management, but the majority of my job, especially now, is grief counseling. So I help people either individually or have a lot of support groups. So I happen to be around a lot of people that are grieving for all kinds of things. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about this subject and talk about, the other losses besides maybe a death, of experiencing a death. So we'll move. The first thing I was going to talk about is just to really start with the basic. What is grief? Well, it varies a lot depending on what resources you go to. There's all kinds of, variations in the definition. But basically, grief is what you feel internal when you've experienced a loss of any kind. It's very personal. It's individual to yourself and to what loss you've experienced. So it can be different. It's very often different for different kinds of losses and different kinds of time periods in your life. So like I'm saying, it's very unique, and many different emotions come out typically. There's all kinds of emotions, and most of them come and go and might come and go again, and might repeat that process many times. Typical emotions, when you have grief, is really just intense anger sometimes, and guilt, sadness, regret. There's really so many different things that can occur. And even tears. I mean, sometimes people can't cry, don't cry. And other people are surprised by the amount that they cry. They cry and they cry and they just cannot believe how much they cry. So ultimately, it's just really different for each and every person. There's similarities, but yet each person will experience it different depending on the loss and the person. But I think the core thing to always remember when you're experiencing any grief is that it's very natural, very normal, and it means you're a human being, basically. So it's good to keep in mind it's a very normal, natural human reaction, although it can be very scary for people, very scary. So tonight I was going to share a little bit about different kinds of losses. And there's different terms. I was just going to, bring up a few. And one of the terms that's well known for losses other than death is something called ambiguous loss. Now, ambiguous loss, when you have an ambiguous loss, it's very different from a loss due to death. And I'll explain that to be when you have a death, normally in a normal day, you have very specific things that you go through and experience. The family gets a death certificate, you have a service, you have a funeral, you have your own certain rituals that you do. All of those things really do actually help people to begin the process and realize the permanence of this situation. So those are things that typically, maybe not so much during this whole COVID experience, but typically people go through. So when I say ambiguous loss, the difference here is that ambiguous loss is very unclear. You're kind of in a limbo with these kinds of losses. You're in a limbo and there's a lot of uncertainty. So the other thing is they could potentially go on for years. So when you look at the screen now, it basically says two different types here. So there's two different types. And the first one reads that the person is psychologically present, but physically absent. So that's the strangeness with this kind of scenario. You have absence and you have presence. So with this first one, when the person is psychologically present, but physically absent, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. That would be like for missing soldiers, soldiers that are just missing in action, missing children, missing people due to disasters, any of these natural disasters that people aren't found, airline crashes or tsunamis, that kind of thing. It's very odd because you don't have that physical body. So the second one is actually just that in reverse. So the person is physically present, but psychologically absent. Now this feels very strange too. This is, I'll give you an example of this kind of situation that probably a lot of you have seen. Dementias, like Alzheimer's. Those are people that are physically present, but a lot of times just psychologically absent. Addictions, people are physically there, but they psychologically aren't. Same with mental illness, traumatic brain injury, that would be in the category. So these losses are really, they're very tough to handle, and they're unique. They're unique because people, when you've experienced something like an ambiguous loss, typically you have to find other ways to find hope. Finding hope might be a little bit more challenging. I will say one thing, at the end of the screen, you can see P. Boss. If you are interested in this topic of ambiguous loss, she is an excellent resource. It's Pauline Boss. And this is someone who studied this for years. And I think she has a new book coming out. And she's an excellent resource, really. So, but I just thought of something I was going to mention. Recently, I ran into this. I was watching it was a little clip on TV, and it was showing a newscaster or a journalist with Tony Bennett. For those of you, obviously everybody knows Tony Bennett. Unfortunately, it was, talking about that he has dementia, I believe Alzheimer's now, and he had that psychological absence, like the interviewer couldn't really interview him. But when Tony Bennett came out and the piano started to play, he right away picked up on the music, and you could see the joy in his face, and everything lit up because he was singing. So that's an example of finding hope in that kind of situation. Like when someone has dementia or Alzheimer's, it's, not all of his mind was present there. He couldn't interact like he used to, but he still can with music. So it's finding what is still available with a person a lot, gives people hope. So I just wanted to mention that. So now we'll move on. And my next screen talks about one other term here. It's called disenfranchised grief. Now, disenfranchised grief. these types of grief experiences, uh, they're it's something that's not really openly acknowledged um, or socially accepted. So often these types of grief issues, well, sadly, a lot of times people don't get the support that they might need. Um, this includes a wide variety of things, really. I'll give you some examples to make it a little, to let you know what could be in this category. Um, infertility. Infertility is one that sometimes is disenfranchised because it's very hurtful to the person that has the infertility issue. But sometimes society, certain people will be apt to say things like, oh, well, you can adopt or you can do this. There's a lot of children in the world, those kinds of things. Not that that's not well-meaning, but for the person that has the infertility problem, that can be really hurtful because they actually want to conceive. Another one would be, big one, is pet loss. Oh my gosh, I can't tell you how many people, and I know myself, we're all, a lot of us animal lovers out there. When a pet dies, it is devastating. So sometimes people will say, well, when you're going to get another one, as if a pet, as if an animal is less than, another loss. And we know for a lot of people, that's not true. We love them like our family sometimes. Um, as a healthcare person, I've seen this also with people that lose a limb. Maybe they lose a leg below the knee or lose an arm. Those kind of people go through a lot of challenges too, I have to say, and sometimes that's not as recognized. Also, I know this is death related, but I have to say people that lose a sibling sometimes, we tend to give attention a lot of times to people that lose a spouse or a child, or when someone says a brother or sister, sometimes there's not as much attention, and that brother or sister might have been really a special person in their lives. Also, in this category would be like those unrecognized relationships. People that have common law marriages, that they never had that marriage certificate. Sometimes people brush that off like, oh, well, you really weren't married. Well, for the common law couple that was very much together, that can be very disturbing because that's still a very hard loss for them. Same even sometimes for ex-spouses. There's still that connection there with an ex-spouse. And also in this category, even addictions. Sometimes addictions are not, almost shamed. Suicides. So those kinds of things. And there's many more, but it's just basically like the slide says, when someone has experienced a loss and it's not really recognized as much or acknowledged by others, that can be really hurtful. So next I have what we've all been experiencing and continue to experience. It seems like over these past 2 years, we've all gotten a lot of experience in the grief world. And although we see on this slide death, loss of life, which of course has been just a beyond terrible thing, there's been a lot of other loss as well. So in these circles, you'll see and probably recognize in yourself or someone that some of these things, that you've gone through. And this really is grieving. This over the past 2 years, the whole world, when you think about it, has, left people with this unsettled, isolated, anxious feeling. And a lot of this stuff has happened in people's lives, even multiple episodes of things. So not only this, but when we stop and think about it, this pandemic time period has made us really grieve as society. You know, we're grieving together in society, and we've had a lot of issues come up in the world that are really upsetting to a lot of people. And that's community grief as well. So, like I said, in this slide, you'll probably find at least one thing here that, you know, you've run into, particularly even loss of the future is huge, because this pandemic has gone on for some length of time now. And people get worried, you know, how long will this last? How much of my future is going to be disturbed by this? You know, what else am I going to miss? Because there's the loss of events. You know, so many people have lost the opportunities to share in these special events too. So, and not to mention also the loss of health is huge, because not only people suffering from COVID, but also their own health issues that they might have had prior, or have you know, come up since this whole experience. So the pandemic has definitely brought about people talking about grief. So maybe in some way that actually will, at least people talking about it now might make a difference too. So I have also just this one last screen on different, just to show you the variety of losses that can occur. You know, it's something to stop and think about every once in a while, because a lot of these sometimes they're just kind of brushed aside as something that goes on, and we don't necessarily see it as grief, but it certainly can bring about grief. The ones that we didn't mention so far, like I said, divorce is huge. Divorce can be a long, drawn out grieving process, I have to say. Losing job and the financial stability. Even retirement's kind of huge, because you have to adapt and create a whole new life after many years of a job and a routine. So, and on the other side, you see loss of a dream. So sometimes that is very much what happens too. People have a dream, have a few dreams, and they just don't work out for one reason or another. And when that happens, you know, people have to step back and kind of reevaluate and figure things out. But it can be a real challenge, and you could certainly go through a grieving process while that's happening. One other thing on this list that I want to point out that I see sometimes, and it's not to be discounted at all, loss of a friendship. Loss of a friendship is huge for people, because, you know, we choose our friends, and it's very upsetting, you know, to lose a friendship. It can mean so much to us. So, and of course, things like moving, we know, moving is huge too, right? You pick up, you go to a different community, you don't know anyone. That's a huge process. So this is just basically to show you that there are so many different kinds of ways that you can certainly grieve. And so I'm going to move to the next slide. And of course, I know I'm talking to caregivers this evening. And wow, I'm always amazed by caregivers, because, you know, whether you're working for work caregiving, or you're caring for a family member, you're caring for a friend or a neighbor, or maybe even multiple people, it's a huge job to be a caregiver. I mean, it's really a really important one to And it's, I don't know, it's so many things. Important, extremely important for so many reasons. But the thing that's kind of a little difficult here, if you're a caregiver, sometimes the person that you're caregiving for, or the people that you're caregiving for, are going through something. Maybe they're going through their own grief. So you're helping them and you're kind of going through their grief with them, maybe sometimes. And then you have your own grief too to deal with. Sometimes that can get a little challenging when you're surrounded by grief, theirs and yours. And sometimes it's a matter of kind of learning to step aside from other people. Not that you can't be there and listen and support them, but you need to take care of your own self too when you're grieving over something. So that's important to remember as a caregiver, I think, because I know how caregivers are always out there, always trying to help someone else, but it is important to also step back and help yourself, especially if you're having going through something difficult, going through any kind of grieving process. So I was going to next, I was going to talk about some strategies, but before that, if it's okay with everyone, I have a favorite little meditation book, and I'll write it at the. It'll show up on the end of the slides in case you like this. I have two readings. I was going to read my first one now, but it's from a little book that I have that I've had for years that I enjoy. It's called A Time to Grieve. And the author's name is Carol Strawdacker. And I was just going to read something to you. As you can see, this screen is a little directionless. So it starts off and it says, grief has no clear direction. There is no direct path through the many emotional territories that make up our loss. So it's only natural that we would hope for clearer signs, for a roadmap of sorts that would guide us through the grieving process. But each of us finds our own way or makes our own way, depending on our circumstances and our character. Imagine that you follow along your path of sorrow. You're pleased because you sense that you're making a little bit of headway. Then you round the bend and find that a large tree has fallen upon your path. Now you can choose to do one of two things. You can view the tree as an obstacle and turn around and go in another direction. Or you can view the tree as a stepping stone that was delivered onto your path. You can step up onto the tree and climb over. If there is no path at all, if your grief seems to be a solid, impenetrable forest, stand back a moment and remind yourself that a forest is made up of single trees. Each takes up space. It's true, but there is a space around each one to allow it to grow. And it is that same space that also allows you to pass. By thinking of the forest as a collection of individual trees, you can slip in among them and cross through to the clearing where sun filters down to the forest floor and brighter days are possible. So I have one more reading also to do, but I just thought I'd stop and read that. And sometimes those kinds of things are helpful also for you or another person that's grieving, to stop and, do a little meditation, and that can be helpful. Coping strategies, that's what everybody wants to know, right? What do I do? What do I do? Bottom line is, I think we all learn these coping strategies, no matter what they are. Sometimes people pick some pretty unhealthy ones, to be honest. Uh, drinking a lot, eating, um, gambling, shopping, even shopping. People sometimes shop, as a way to cope. Drugs, basically whatever people can find maybe to numb themselves and not feel what they're feeling, because it's hard sometimes to feel these feelings. But better, it's a little bit better probably to try and find some things on the other spectrum that can maybe be helpful. So even if you've made or you see someone making some bad choices, there's always hope for a little turnaround. And sometimes it starts off really small, which is okay too. But there's different choices. We can make different choices. And sometimes it takes a little bit of creativity and a lot of flexibility, because sometimes you might try to cope and have this strategy, and then it stops working. And then you got to try something else. It's often a lot of trial and error in the land of grief, because sometimes it's longer lasting than people think. And sometimes something works for a little while, and then it stops helping. So here is a screen that lists a wide variety of things that you can do, all kinds of things. I think ultimately, I usually suggest to people to start with the basics. If you're going through a grieving experience and things are overwhelming, it might be best to actually first focus on what's most important. So what's most important? Doing things like eating, making sure you eat, drinking water, sleeping somewhat. And if sleep is troublesome, resting, getting some sunlight, getting some outdoor time, some kind of movement, exercise. That's what I mean by the basics. That's your own self-care, and that becomes really important when you're having any kind of grief experience. We need to take care of ourselves to get through the whole experience. So those basics, just taking care of yourself, making sure you're eating, sleeping, drinking, those kinds of things. And then, you can pick and choose from a variety of things that, might be helpful. I think one thing I notice about people sometimes is, well, very often, people are very hard on themselves a lot of times when they're having when they're grieving a loss of any kind. And say, for example, a person used to read. Now, all of a sudden, they pick up a book and they cannot read. Why can't I read? It's bothersome. What's wrong with me? What is wrong with my brain that I can't read? It's better actually just to let it go at that point. Most people, if that happens to them, they will read again. Honestly, it's a temporary thing, because your brain is not actually acting as it normally does. When you're having a grief experience, your brain is not 100% at all. So, choose something else. If you're having trouble with reading, choose another activity. Maybe you want to draw. Maybe you want to journal, just to write everything down that you're going through. Write out your anger, write out your anxiety, write whatever you want. That's the wonderful thing about journaling, is you can do it your own way, in your own time, however you want. No one even has to read it. So often I also think of things as a little bit of addition and subtraction, actually. The only time I use math. So you can think about it as, what could I add? What could I add? If you need something to add, that would be helpful. Maybe I need to just, it's cold outside and it's gray. Maybe I just need to take some time to wrap up in a blanket, have some hot cocoa, and listen to some music. Maybe that's what I need. And then what do I need to subtract? Well, my time's tight for the whole day. Would I be able to lie down and listen to music and have a hot cocoa? Well, I guess I could if I subtract something. What could I subtract? Well, maybe watching, an hour and a half of the news, because I find the news really upsetting, and all the alerts and all the tragic things out there. It's kind of making me anxious. So that's a good thing to actually develop. I think these are skills to develop, to realize maybe what's good for you, what's not good for you. And, TV is one of them, I have to say, for a lot of people, news, even if you like the news, I think it's helpful sometimes to limit it, and to switch to maybe a lighter show or a movie that you're interested in. So it goes along with knowing how you feel or beginning to maybe try to recognize how you feel. I'm kind of feeling anxious. Well, maybe I should try something calming. You can even plan out coping skills, I have to say, ahead of time, like this list here. You could go and look them up. You could write them down and have them there to go to. Say, for example, gosh, every day at 4 o'clock, I feel terrible. And I got to have something to keep my hands busy. One of these adult coloring books can help people. 4 o'clock every day, you bring out the book and you start to do it. And it allows your brain to have a little break. Because when you're grieving, I have to say, it is okay to take a break. It's very hard sometimes when you're grieving that you just want to, you think you have to concentrate it on all times, but it actually is a good thing to have a break. So say maybe you notice that your energy is drained. You're just feeling sluggish and not well. Well, maybe if you try a little bit of movement, you don't even have to call it exercise. I won't call it exercise, just movement. Even 5 minutes, even just, walking around the house, something simple. So like anything else, I think it is really a lot of trial and error to see what is going to work for you, what would help you. So, but those are a few ideas. Maybe you've looked at the screen and saw something that was appealing. Everybody's different, but it's good to have a lot of different ideas, and that's how you get better, I think. Sometimes people have an idea that just, you try it out and you see how it works. Okay, so grief is definitely something that is hard on the brain and the heart. That's why you see both here. Some people, I think they feel it maybe a little bit more in their heart. Some people feel it more in their heads. Some people, it's both at once. So if you find yourself, in one of these circumstances, or you begin to feel like something's not quite right, you might want to ask yourself, maybe this is something that's grief related, and know that it's okay. It's normal. You can certainly grieve something, a loss, other than someone's death. It's normal. And it doesn't have to be minimized either. Even if you feel like it might be, like that disenfranchised grief we talked about, if you feel like it's minimized by someone else, you don't have to allow that in yourself. It is valid. It's valid. If you experience a loss and you're feeling badly about it and you're having grief, it is certainly something good to recognize. Sometimes that recognition and acknowledgement of it can actually be helpful all by itself, just to acknowledge that it's there. Like, yeah, I've been feeling a certain kind of way. It's grief. And then you take one step at a time and you see, well, maybe if I try this will help. a lot of times it does take time. I think it takes time, and it, depending on what you do with your time, can be more helpful. So that's why it's good to do what you can, if you want to talk about it with someone, it's good to seek out someone that you think might be good to talk to. Not everybody is, to be honest. I mean, we have different people in our lives that are good for different things. So not all your friends or family members might be, that person to talk with. Maybe it's someone from the outside. But talking helps, and doing all these coping skills that work for you are good. Writing, journaling is always good. Music. So okay, well, I am getting near the end, and I wanted to read the last meditation that I was talking about. So this is from the same book, the same author. And she writes, finally, one day, I didn't have to force myself anymore. So during the worst of grief, it can seem as if every civilized act, every simple function, even every move we make is forced. Great effort is required to get out of bed, to get home from work, or sometimes even to get from one side of the room to the other. So, but then eventually, as we work through our grief, the load that weighed us so heavily begins to lessen. Tomorrow seems less like an ordeal and more like an opportunity. The dark side of our spirit subsides. It happens gradually, but it does happen. One day we find that less effort is required for the things that once took an enormous amount of exertion. One day we realize that we are again capable of feeling delight, inspiration, and anticipation. So again, I did write on the bottom of this screen in case either one of those were appealing to you. It's a nice little book. And I do want to let you know too, if you please always feel free. I tell people my number is listed on there. If you yourself or you know someone that is experiencing grief in any kind of way and maybe doesn't have support out there from anyone and is seeking support, please feel free to share my number with them because I certainly love to help out someone like that maybe doesn't have anyone to talk to, because there are certainly people out there that are struggling, especially now. And just know I'm available. Or if you have any questions about maybe what I've talked about, if you want further information or any concerns or anything, feel free to call too. But I'm hoping maybe tonight you got a little bit of information that kind of, that maybe you didn't know before or didn't realize, or maybe it's a little easing on your mind of validating that, yeah, we go through all of these things sometimes in our life, and there's certainly a lot of different levels of grief and different reactions. And I think, the one thing is when you go through something, I think you develop a little sensitivity to other people. And that's probably a good thing, because there's a lot of people out there now, especially and in our future, that are going to need some sensitive people that have some understanding. So yeah, I hope everyone got something from this. And thank you, Mary, for having me back to talk.
Thank you, Beth.